Okay, so I'm going to show you how to set up RTran to run with the input file that it needs. And I'm going to assume you've downloaded and installed RTran and checked that it's running correctly. So you've got an RTran folder like this. And when you open it, you should have these files in there. So RTran basically works by reading in a single file called user input. It's an Excel file that you set up with all the inputs that RTran needs to run. And all that RTran does is read in that input file and produce some outputs from that input file. I'll do that now so we can show that process, but I'll speed it up so we don't have to wait. Okay, so as you see, a box has popped up telling me it's saved an output to output 1 Excel spreadsheet. So let's just check that that's there. And there it is there. So RTran's finished run, it's started up, it's read in user input spreadsheet, which specifies the inputs. It's produced an output spreadsheet. It also stores some outputs in this folder, TinyGIS folder, which you shouldn't look at directly. You should use the TinyGIS program to look at. But we won't go through outputs here. This is just to show the process of how RTran runs. The only file that it depends on is this user input. Any changes you make to that file will affect the running of RTran. RTran does not change that file, it just reads it. So let's take a look at that file now then, the main input file, user input. Okay, so this is the spreadsheet. There are a whole number of different sheets in the spreadsheet, and I'll go through each of them in turn. The important thing to know though is that this is it's just a regular workbook, a regular Excel workbook. The only difference is that RTran expects certain sheets to be in the workbook with particular names, and it reads in those sheets and uses the parameters in them. You can still create any other sheets you like, so you can easily insert a sheet, call it whatever you like, as long as it's not one of the RTran specific sheets that RTran's expecting, and you can have whatever you like in that sheet. It won't make any difference to RTran at all what you have in there, even if it's linked to the RTran sheets. It doesn't matter, you're free to do anything like that. So I'll get rid of that. I'll skip the core input sheet for now because it's a very important one and takes some time to go through, and we'll start with some simpler ones. The first sheet I'm going to talk about is the trip sheet. So in RTran, the trip sheet is basically specifying the trip origins. So here we've got a 20 by 20 city. And you can have a smaller city, but in this example it's a 20 by 20 city, and in each of the cells in the city it says how many trips originate from that cell. So if I just zoom in so you can see it, in the top cell here it's saying there are 782 trips from this particular cell here, and 4,118 trips from this cell. The activities sheet is essentially destinations. It tells you the number of trips to each square. So here it's saying there are 782 trips to this, which just happens to be, if we go back and look at the trips from, it happens to be the same number as the trips from. This doesn't have to be the case, so I can change this to whatever I like, and I will. I'll just change a bunch of these to have one trip from them, and change some other one to have 1,000 trips to it. So you can change this however you like. But this sheet specifies the number of trips from each zone. This specifies the number of trips to each zone. Now, of course, you should have to make sure that the number of trips from all of the zones is the same as the number of trips to all the zones. So the sum of all of these cells in the trips sheet should be the same as the sum of all these cells in the activity sheet. But actually, if it's not, RTran will simply correct that for you. But you might like to, for your own accounting and thinking, just try to keep that right. Okay, so trips from each zone, trips to each zone, car speeds. This specifies basically the uncongested road speed in each grid square. So the road network, if you recall, is always assumed to essentially be a Manhattan block everywhere. So you can travel from any cell, north, south, east or west from that cell. And this sheet tells you the uncongested speed when you're traveling through each cell. This sheet here gives the capacity of each cell. So it's sort of like the road capacity. And when RTran runs, you can run it with congestion on, and it will calculate the number of cars, the number of vehicles traveling through each cell, and if that exceeds the capacity, or as it approaches the capacity of the cell, traffic can slow down due to congestion. But I'll talk about that in a separate video later. The bus, I'll also talk about the bus and train sheets in a separate video because that requires a little time. But basically, these sheets set up the public transport network. So I'll skip over all the public transport sheets through to the walk costs per kilometre sheet. So this sheet says what the walk cost per kilometre is in dollars. So this is for calculating the generalised cost of walking, and it says if you walk a kilometre in this zone, in fact in any zone because it's the same everywhere, but if you walk a kilometre in this zone, it's perceived to have the equivalent cost as a $5.25 monetary cost. And you could change it if, let's say, there was a park here. You might say, oh, it's more pleasant to walk through a park. And I'll say that walking through these squares because they're nice parkland or they're away from traffic have a lower perceived cost. So that's what this sheet is for, to specify the perceived cost per kilometre of walking. Bike cost per kilometre is the same. It's for calculating the generalised cost of biking, and it's again just a number in each cell. Parking cost is just that. It's the cost of parking in each grid square. So if you drive a car to this square here and park, it costs you $11.10 to park. You'll see in this example spreadsheet, I've actually used a formula to calculate this, but you can just specify, enter in the numbers if you like. So if you want to enter in your own costs, you can do so. The only caveat on that is that you have to include parking revenue. So you'll see that there's a parking cost sheet and a parking revenue sheet, and these two are important in different ways. So this parking revenue sheet shows the revenue to government or the transport agency of each parking spot. So here you can think about that as, say, a $2 government levy on parking in these squares, and a $1 government levy on parking in these squares here. I'll just make it a bit bigger so you can see. So the parking costs here, if I again make that bigger, should be at least the parking revenue. So if I don't want to use a formula, I could say, okay, well there's a $15 charge plus the $2 government charge. And that would make $17 for each of these zones. So here, if I just look at the formula there, I've said the cost to park in that square is whatever the government levy is, an additional $15. Return parking costs, okay, so this is an important distinction. Parking cost and parking cost return are important differences because RTran works on return trips. So a trip starts here, might go to the city here, and then return back to there. Or a trip may start in the city, drive out to here, and then return back to here. Now let's take that particular trip. Let's say a trip started in the city, drove out to here, to some workplace here, somebody worked, and then they returned back to here at the end of the day. The parking costs at the end of the day, or at the end of the model period, may be different to the parking costs during the period. So that's what the parking costs return is. It's saying, what are the parking costs for the end of the second leg? This one is saying, what's the parking cost at the end of the first leg? So it's basically saying, if you're driving into the city, it costs a lot to park there. But if you're returning to the city, at the end of the second leg, it doesn't cost you anything. The last sheet here shows any per kilometre charges you want to impose on vehicles. So for example, if you had a congestion charge, you could do it in this sheet here. So in these squares you specify what the cost is per kilometre, the tax essentially per kilometre imposed by government. So if there was a congestion tax for travelling in these squares here, and you wanted to charge people 10 cents a kilometre, you'd do it like that. So you'd specify these squares here, 10 cents per kilometre. And that's essentially the main sheets, except for the public transport sheets, which I'll talk about well, except for the public transport sheets and the core input sheet, which I'll talk about in separate videos.